Hello, everyone, and good morning. My name is Chobra, and welcome to the first episode of The Connection, a dual podcast where I share gaming and esports news from Korea in English, and then gaming and esports from the rest of the world, mostly, from the West in Korean. And yes, I know it's probably evening for most people listening live, but it's a solid 11 a.m. here in Seoul, so that's good morning to you all. Personally, I'm pretty excited to start this series because connecting gaming and esports from Korea to the West and then vice versa has been something that's pretty core to my heart since the beginning of my career within esports. And I think this is mostly because of how I grew up as well. I've talked about this briefly in the past through various platforms, but having grown up both in Korea and in the States and various parts of the States as well, and therefore also being exposed to gaming and esports at varying times and through different mediums, I think I've always just had a heart for, trying to bridge that gap a little bit. And not because, any one thing is absolutely better than the other or, one group is always doing it better than the other, but just because, especially as, everything becomes more and more global because of the IT age we live in, there's just a lot you can gain from that. And I think my start in esports really coincides with that quite well because I started my career in esports in 2012, at least at a professional and career level. Right before that, I dabbled a little bit here and there. I joined some clans and we played some amateur tournaments and various things. But 2012 was when I said, all right, I'm going to put some time into this, see if I can make a career out of it. Thankfully, things worked out and things kicked off from there. But personally, I think back and I say, maybe 2011 through 2013, maybe 2010, depending on kind of which aspect you're looking at, was when esports and gaming as a partner in that really became intentionally global. And I say intentionally because obviously, online tournaments and streaming platforms, etc., came by before that as well. But I think with the introduction of some new games during that age, notably League of Legends and Dota 2, and also just new systems and new organizations kind of entering the fray, whether it's publishers and developers or whether it's organizations and broadcasters, TOs, maybe even some teams, they made a very intentional choice to kick things off globally and make sure that there's a global presence, whether it's the tournament, whether it's their players. And I happened to join right at that time, and probably because of that wave also, because for those of you who know, I started mostly as a translator. I think joining in that wave really made me think, all right, here's what I can do, right? And it's something that I can uniquely do. And when I say unique, I don't mean just me, myself, and I, but there's a smaller group of us who have had this unique experience. And I don't mean just language barrier, but also engaging and experiencing gaming and esports from different platforms and different angles around the world. So, if the overall industry is going in that direction, why don't we try to make sure that we're bridging that gap holistically and not just by saying, hey, here's a stream in English and here's a stream in Korean and other languages, or maybe it's in a different time zone. That's at a very surface level, and that's just the first step. So now that I'm back in Korea as a freelancer, I thought it'd be a good time to kick this off. It's something that I've always worked towards in the various positions I've held in my previous workplaces, but now I get to try to tackle it in different means that I've thought up on my own. Ideally, this is the first of many projects, and more to come in a similar vein, but we'll see how things go, right? One step at a time. Just a note, if you are watching live on Twitch, feel free to discuss, respond, and ask questions in chat if appropriate to the context. Your comments will be included in the show, and after the podcast, we'll have a little bit of time to just chit-chat freely before I start my regular streaming schedule as well. So, what do we plan to talk about on The Connection? Anything and everything related to gaming and esports from Korea. Naturally, this can spread a bit thin, but as we go, I'll be looking to focus on scenes or reactions that aren't as commonly shared with the global audience, such as Kartrider, which we'll talk about more later. So, this means that things like, probably the best example is League of Legends, right? I might bring things up that if there's a huge update or, maybe there's a big upset in the tournament, those might be discussed. But I just think there's so many resources out there already where we can engage in that conversation and that content. So I want to try to tackle some other aspects that, just haven't had as much exposure. For the first episode today, we'll do a bit of an overview to get us all started. So some of you listening might only really be aware of gaming in Korea because of League of Legends, which is fine, which is totally fine. And then maybe some of you are, old school OG esports fans and became familiar with Korea through Brood War way back in the day. And then maybe some of you are actually just huge MMORPG fans and have played through various Korean games like MapleStory or Mabinogi. And if you're a big MMORPG fans, those are two huge staples that came out from Korea, both in the RPG sense and then for MapleStory, obviously a huge proponent of microtransactions, but that's a whole other box we won't open today. Well, the good news is there's quite a bit more going on within Korean gaming as well. I was actually even surprised to see how much things have changed when I came back to Seoul end of last year. And I say changed because back in the day, for one, we didn't have as much information readily available, right? Just throughout the world and even within Korea about who's playing what. And I think this is the same in the States, right? Ever since, YouTube and streaming and all these platforms became bigger and social media, we're now much more aware of what other people are playing, what other people are watching. Back in the day, it was just me and my friends right in our neighborhood. And if this game was big amongst us, like that was it. That was the game. Maybe no one else played it in our city, but that's okay because we didn't know. But even in Korea, that seems to have changed. In Korea, because of the way PC cafes kind of took over as a mainstay in entertainment and leisure, and especially in gaming, it was really hard to imagine that there was gaming outside of what you saw at the PC cafe. And to a certain extent, it's still kind of true, right? League of Legends is still back at it, holding first place in PC cafes for quite some time again. I think they're entering another 80-week streak. And that's, of course, that's only 80 because it got broken in the middle after so many months and years. But they're still at the top. And then PUBG continues to reign supreme amongst battle royales and FPSs or even third-person shooters. But aside from the PC cafe playtime, there seems to be a lot more publicity around a variety of games, both for esports and even just single player or online games that aren't competitive or PvP. So let's talk about the esports aspect first. For esports, you have the two pillars, right? You have League of Legends and StarCraft holding the fort as always. Of course, unfortunately, it was confirmed recently that both the LCKs, so that's Champions and Challengers Leagues, will be closed off to the public due to the outbreak of the coronavirus. The good news for global fans, I guess, is the matches and broadcasts will continue as planned. But obviously for the fans here in Korea, they're not able to go and cheer for their teams and watch the matches live. So hopefully the virus can be contained to an extent where officials and the public feel comfortable opening up these events again. StarCraft isn't free from those health concerns either. The Africa Star League, known as ASL, which, if you weren't aware, that's the one that runs on StarCraft Remastered. That is not the one that used to be part of the WCS with StarCraft 2, which has now been changed to the ESL Pro Tour, etc., etc. This is the league that was kicked off again when StarCraft Remastered came out. But anyway, the ASL is meant to kick off again soon, but they announced that there might be some potential updates to the schedule due to the coronavirus. So maybe they're going to choose to delay things a little bit, as we've seen the LPL do in China. Or maybe they'll do what the LCK is doing and just close it off from the public, but make sure that the league runs on its own schedule. We will have to wait and see how that works out, but one thing's for sure, the coronavirus is taking a toll on kind of the gaming, entertainment, and IT world here in Asia. And I think, this isn't about scaring anyone, but I think it's mostly just, listen, things are a little unknown. So from an official standpoint, you got to take your precautions. So I think it's totally fair, but obviously we all hope that things can be cleared up a little bit as soon as possible so that these events can kind of take their former forms once again. Now, aside from these two pillars, and there's plenty of others, that you might be aware of, right? Of course, PUBG has been a big part of the Korean esports scene ever since it came out. But what's commonly unknown is actually that there's another game that within Korea would be considered another pillar, or even might even contest both of those brands, League of Legends and StarCraft, when it comes to esports. And it's Kartrider. And I know, especially some people in Korea are going to come up and say, well, how could it possibly contest StarCraft? And I don't mean in terms of the popularity or, the impact it had, but really just the fact that it's been going for so long. Technically speaking, the Kartrider League is the longest running league. Granted, they did have a break for a bit over a year, but officially, quote unquote, it was a hiatus. So technically, they're the longest running league. But if you don't know about Kartrider, you're in for a treat. So this game came out in 2004, and then the first league kicked off in 2005. Just so we have some perspective, 2004, if that number already doesn't feel like a long time ago, so in the gaming world, we can relate that to, let's see, Far Cry 1 came out in 2004. I believe World of Warcraft came out in 2004. Counter-Strike Source came out in 2004. And Halo 2 came out in 2004. And it was only 2003, I believe, that Halo CE came out on PC. So, right, like, we're talking about these games as like remasters and nostalgia. And this game that's been running a professional league is now still going in 2020. If that doesn't give you enough nostalgia, if we talk about movies in 2004, we're talking about The Incredibles, iRobot, which is a personal favorite of mine. We also have, I believe, Dodgeball, and then The Day After Tomorrow, which, I don't know, at the time, it seemed like a movie that no one else watched, but I guess a lot of people have watched it now that I see it mentioned all the time. And then Mean Girls, if your timeline works on the chick flick timeline, then Mean Girls was 2004 as well, I found out. So, yeah, it's a long time ago. Well, so this game it's not a remaster. It's just, obviously it's had updates, but it's just the original game itself from 2004 that has gone through all these updates and then started a league in 2005, and it's still going. And if you're not sure what Kartrider is, I mean, it's as the name says. It is a racing game, and it's a kart racing game, but it has insanely technical drift mechanics. So when you first play the game online, usually you're introduced first to the item mode, which is as you would expect. If you've played any other kart racing game, through a different brand, you know what I'm talking about. You go on a track, you have to go through it like 2, maybe 4 laps. There are these like item boxes or balloons or whatever it might be for that brand that you run through, and you get items that help you get an advantage or help you defend your lead. And there's some RNG involved, and that's why it's fun, and it kind of feels like a party game. There's definitely skill involved, but you can still have fun with it even if you're not the greatest. And that's how Kartrider started as well. But they also have these drift mechanics which really shine in speed mode, which is without any items. And what happens there is these pros who are now playing Kartrider professionally, for one, they race at speeds I personally did not think was possible in Kartrider as a game, right? Because I played it as a kid just as a racing game with items. But then watching these pros, the speed's just incredible. And then while I don't know like exactly what's going on, right? Like all the different techniques they're using, I just know I've never seen the game played like that, whether it's on my own or with my friends. And that's how you know that it's something special. And again, just because of the pure speed, the races are just over faster than I've ever experienced them. So something unique is going on. And and I think now probably the public servers are also just riddled with players who are super super experienced. I can only imagine that because the next iteration of Kartrider Drift was announced last year, and the first beta was open. Well, not open to the public, but it was open to invitation, and I got to try it, and I I chose to play on the Korean servers, and just got my butt whooped the whole time, because I guess it's just all these players who have been playing the original Kartrider for freaking 16 years, and I'm I'm trying to play this beta of a new version against them. But anyway, going back to the actual theme about Kartrider and its league. Um, this league, it had its ups and downs, but it's still going strong. And it went through so many different iterations as well, right? Originally, it was just solos, right? You play for yourself. And then they added team mode where you'd have to play in duos and then later in fours as a team. So it kind of turns into, whether it's team racing, if you're into racing, or for people who might not be into a lot of different racing genres, maybe if you watch the Olympics, like short track speed skating, right? You're on a team and you each have your own role. And it's so interesting to hear these pros talk about that in Kartrider, right? Like they have these roles and positions and they say, well, I'm the guy who like defends second place and I just make sure that our first place guy can keep his lead. And, I'm the guy in the back who's just making sure I'm scouting and getting, if it's the item mode, which they also chose to add later on. They were like, all right, we're also going to have item mode within our tournaments. And it's like, all right, well now, like it's important to have these items coming up from the back. It's insane the risk they decided to take, and also the variety they decided to add to the tournament, where each individual player can still show off their skills, but now you have this team factor, which obviously makes it a little bit more appealing for organizations and sponsors. And then item mode makes it a little bit more appealing to the casual fan because it's just something you're more used to. It also shakes up the standings a little bit. And it just survived for 16 years with a 1 year break, or 15 years for the league, all throughout. And when it's played at its highest level, it is some of the most nail-biting esports moments I've ever seen. And I'm not exaggerating. When I'm uploading this to YouTube, I should try to make sure I can include that clip. There's an infamous clip where the two best players, and one of them was the best player ever since he started playing, which was, I believe, in third grade, in elementary school. They're in the finals, 1-on-1, and I think the race ends with I want to say 3/1000th of a second, but maybe it's 3/100th. I want to say it's 3/1000th of a second. And it's the craziest thing I've seen in esports. One of the craziest things. There are many crazy things that have happened in the history of esports, so I can't say the craziest, but it would definitely rank personally after having seen it. So, and this is a game that, if you lived in Korea, especially any time between like 2004 and I would say up to 2010, you've probably played it at least once. You've seen your friends play it. This is the game that when I talk to my Korean friends and they don't play games or they don't really know esports. If they live in Korea, they kind of know it exists, but they don't really know. They hear about League of Legends because it's so big now, and they know StarCraft, but they don't follow the scene. But then they say, oh, like, do people still play Kartrider? Like, that's the game that comes up, right? It's not, do people still play like Mario or I don't know, Super Smash Brothers? It's like, do people like, is Kartrider still a thing? Because I played that. Like, this is that game. So it's just such a widely known brand. And the history of Kartrider is, we could spend a whole separate episode on that alone, because the game actually originates from a game called Crazy Arcade from Nexon themselves, which had its own brand, and then they took the characters and they made Kartrider. That's a whole another story of its own. But my point is that there's this game that has this deeply ingrained history in gaming, not necessarily at the forefront of esports, but in gaming in Korea, and actually had its own, I guess, sturdy foundation within esports, even to the point where after that hiatus, Nexon actually funded the tournaments purely themselves to bring it back until they could find a stable, sponsorship and partnership. So it's crazy to see that the game itself actually had a resurgence last year, and no one really knows why, but there were a couple engine updates, and then obviously just all these special events based around microtransactions have been going throughout the years, so I'm sure that's helped retain some of the audience. But the game's resurged, the tournaments therefore have grown again, and then Kartrider was actually featured in the second episode of 10, or the esports night, which if you follow StarCraft, you might have heard of that event, because the first episode was rematch rather between SKT and KT to mimic the old Pro League rivalry. So for this game to follow in the footsteps of something like that, which if you're a StarCraft fan, you know how much that means, that's pretty nuts. So I brought up Kartrider today because, again, it's one of the more well-known domestic games and leagues in Korea, but there's a lot aside from that as well. There's a lot of these niche genres and leagues and games and communities that just don't see a lot of light, because at the end of the day, Korea is just a smaller country compared to, a lot of other nations around the world. And obviously maybe bigger than some, but smaller than a lot. And especially when compared to the United States, where if you really think about it, we think about the United States and it's like, okay, we know Fortnite's huge. We know League of Legends is massive. But there's also just a ton of people playing, say, like a bunch of indie games, right? There's a ton of people enjoying Dead Cells, for instance. It's just the game that popped up in my mind. But, for one, it's obviously not an esport, but two, when there's updates, people might be streaming and etc., but people just kind of play it in their own circles, and, maybe that community discusses it amongst themselves a lot, but it's not at the forefront, right? No one says, oh yeah, Dead Cells is huge in America. Like, no one talks about it like that. But because the States is just so much bigger, you just have more people, right? Even if the percentage is the same. And I think that's kind of true when it comes to Korea, is that there's still these pockets of people that have been playing these other games or competing even in these other games, but it's just not as big because the market's just not as big because there's just not as many people. And therefore, the only things that really break through globally, even at a news level, are things that already have an established global circle that includes Korea, aka something like League of Legends. But a good example is the OGN OSL Futures program, which someone actually had asked about that when I announced that I was doing this podcast. Someone said, hey, I recently saw a video of OGN doing a DJ Max tournament. And if you don't know, DJ Max is a crazy rhythm game. And this is true. They did a DJ Max tournament. And it's insane, actually. The people on there are absolute nuts. And they said, well, can we hear more about that? And that was actually part of the OSL Futures program, which is a program that is being used to showcase and breed esports scenes for a collection of games that are outside the usual suspects. So games like Puyo Puyo, DJ Max. Tekken is kind of their forefront game. And while there are a lot of fighting game players within Korea, I mean, Tekken had some leagues here and there, but again, it was never a mainstay in Korea, at least in terms of like broadcasted esports, right? There are just some great players. So I think they're using that as kind of, all right, well, this is a game that we know has an established scene. We know has some established players. Let's make sure we try to support this. But then we're also going to kind of test the waters with these other games. And, if things go well, who knows where that leads. But I know that originally it was announced that the whole point of that program is to help kind of test and establish the waters for a lot of these other games that maybe just don't have as many opportunities to be developed into bigger esports programs. So the OSL Futures program is something that I want to cover probably next week, just because it was also brought up specifically by someone on Twitter. And also I just think it's interesting because, for instance, like Puyo Puyo is not one I would have expected them to pick out as a potential game, but that's something to note. As a side note, OGN also has a darts tournament going on, and I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but there is a darts tournament, and I plan to dig into that as well. That is one that I mean, for one, it's like technically not an esport, so it's kind of outside the regular territory. But there's a darts tournament, and like they bring in a dartboard and they like actually throw darts in the studio, or other times they're playing Puyo Puyo or DJ Max. So there's that. I'm sure, because I actually watched a bit of it on Twitch, so I'm sure you can find a VOD of it if you're really interested. Now that we've covered a little bit of an introduction to, hey, these are the types of things you can expect from esports in Korea that's not League of Legends or StarCraft or PUBG. When it comes to gaming as a whole, well, recently Korea was no exception to the Tarkov phenomenon for Escape from Tarkov. Admittedly, much less than the West, it seems, but the huge surge in popularity of the game, both amongst players and streamers, piqued the interest of several bigger streamers in Korea, and therefore boosting the overall community out here as well. This was one where I was actually a little bit surprised, because I was streaming it myself and had some newer players from Korea join to watch and learn, but also had a couple people who have been playing it like since it was initially out in alpha and early access, which, I mean, obviously, like, I'm not saying I thought there would be zero, but it was just interesting to see that these people were still invested and were, I guess, seemingly happy to see more people playing it from and for a Korean audience. The early access nature and the pricing due to double taxing seem to be keeping most players at bay in Korea. So I do wonder how that's going to turn out. Also, because those two factors, plus the fact that it's on its own launcher, etc., definitely makes it hard to approach at a PC cafe. I mean, pretty much impossible in the current state, but it is going to make it a little difficult. And if you have had any interest in Korea and gaming and esports, you know that just means a lot. It's not necessary, but it's just such a crucial part of marketing and player base that if that's not easily accessible, and if it's not beneficial, right? If there's no point for me to play that game at a PC cafe, but then if I'm getting, like, say, XP boosts when I play a different game, like, I'm probably playing a different game. So in a game like EFT, I'm not quite sure how that would work. Aside from Tarkov, in the past week, I mean, there were some big releases, right? So, or the past couple weeks, there were some big releases, and so Korea was pretty much the same. I mean, Dragon Ball Z Kakarot was insanely popular, also just because, you know, a lot of people in Korea also grew up with Dragon Ball. Yakuza 7 was really popular as well, which was a bit of a sensitive topic. If you do know your global politics, Korea is once again not really at great terms, to say the least, with Japan. So that was a little bit touchy, but most of the streamers and viewers seem to be okay with, you know, just admitting, hey, it's just a game, and also it's a series that a lot of people have been fond of, so let's just like play it and enjoy it as a game and move on. Sudden Attack actually once was Korea's like most played game in the shooter genre, has since fallen off due to a number of things like Overwatch and PUBG. That's a game that actually just recently, I think, released their survival battle royale mode, which it's a little bit late in the party, and that game's also really old, so it shows its age through its graphics, etc. But it did seem to bring about some interest again, and it actually climbed right back up into the top 10 for PC Cafe player base. So I'm wondering if that's going to stick around. Sudden Attack's also a game that I would love to cover later on, because that's an interesting story. Because if you don't know, Sudden Attack 2 existed and then got shut down because people just played Sudden Attack more. Yeah, it's one of those games. In fact, I'm actually wondering if that's what's going to happen to MapleStory. Because MapleStory 2 is like nowhere to be seen on the charts, but MapleStory is still in the top 10. Korean gaming and the communities can be a little weird like that. It can. I think it's a little bit more extreme than we see in other regions, because we see that in other regions, right? We see nostalgia, or we see people hanging on to like older mechanics or graphics, maybe sometimes out of nostalgia, sometimes because it is actually better or you're more familiar. But I think in Korea, it just seems to have a bigger impact when we look at things like that, when the second version of a game purely needs to shut down. There's a lot behind that story, though, both at a political and business level and a player base level. So that's another good aspect of Korean gaming, is just like, how do you retain a player base, right? And why do all these older games still continue to survive and the newer games have a hard time? And the easy answer is, in Korea, just in general, with any trend, if you're, it's just first come, first serve. If you're first in line, then you win. You've won the race just because you were first. But I would say these days it goes way beyond that. I think in the past that was somewhat true. I think these days, because again, Korea is also subject to the same platforms and information that we're all being exposed to around the world through the internet. I don't think it's just that, because the information is out there, right? And people have more of a choice. And if anything, they're a little bit more competitive now. But there is still an aspect of, like, how come newer games have such a harder time breaking through out here than in some other regions? As we're closing off, if I just want to touch upon maybe a couple other big notes. Legends of Runeterra, of course, a new card game from Riot, released recently into its open beta phase. It entered the PC Cafe ranks at 41, which, if you want to read into it, could be considered okay. But otherwise, it's hard to read into because it has only been open. Like, when that rank came out, that was the week it was released. So that was only 3 days? Yeah, 3 days, I think, in Korea. So because of that, I guess you could say, well, that's pretty good, only 3 days, but not really sure how much we can read into that. Of course, it's also just open beta, so we'll see how that goes. Warcraft 3 Reforged has actually been dropping in rank, and that's kind of hard to see, because usually when a game gets released, it just has an effect, right? Oh, it was just released, it's fresh. So usually for at least 1 week, it climbs, even if it's a minimal amount. And the fact that it's dropping probably says a lot. Also, obviously, there's probably a limited player base for nostalgia, and I doubt people are sitting in the PC cafes playing the campaigns, so there's something to say about that. But I don't think it's just that, considering the reaction from the Western audience as well. So yeah, that's a little bit sad to see. Rainbow Six Siege actually has been rising again, and the community is assuming that that's probably because of the anticipation around the esports scene as well, which is, I think, a huge compliment to Rainbow Six, just in general. I always knew, at least in the States, that was a big thing, that their support for the game and the esports scene was so consistent that it's one of those success stories when, especially from Ubisoft, where they basically kind of revived the game on its own. But it seems like that's having an effect in Korea as well. Is Apex any popular with the new season about to start? Quite frankly, I didn't browse through the Apex specific communities too much, but not that much. And I think, again, that's something that would be a good test case for what I mentioned earlier on retaining a player base. In Korea, I just think it's very rare for people to drop a game and then come back. It's one of two things. Either it's very soon, hey, I dropped the game, but then next week there's supposed to be a big update, so I'm gonna come back. I'm just I intentionally drop it temporarily, or it's been 2 years, right? I think it's this or that, and I think it's very rare for people to bother investing going back to a game, which is, I personally love Apex Legends. I love the gameplay. I've always been a huge supporter of Respawn ever since they were established. I have very high hopes for them, maybe unfairly so at times. And it's kind of sad to see, because from a gameplay level, Apex Legends was one of those games that could kind of be a game that came late and made a success story in Korea. And I think a lot of Koreans thought that, but there's actually a lot of Korean content creators who have discussed why Apex wasn't able to retain its player base in Korea specifically, more so than other regions. So, when the time is right, that could be something that we dive into as well. Well, looks like time flies. I think in future episodes, we might really just have to talk about like one game in one league, or extend the time and just break it off into parts. Because right now, like I tested this too, and this is right about the time I did expect, but it does go by pretty quick. Well, that's it for the first episode. So in the future, we'll see how we can make sure that we deep dive a little bit more into things that are coming out of Korea. But for now, thank you for listening to The Connection. And if you have any questions or suggestions, let me know in chat, or if you're watching on YouTube, down below in the comments. If you liked the content, if you're on Twitch, consider dropping a follow right up top. And if you're on YouTube, consider the good old like and subscribe combo, and stay tuned for updates. That's it for this week, and we'll return next week with more news and thoughts from gaming in Korea here on The Connection.